has seen historic success in the Everglades.
As Fox 35's Carla Byron explains, it's helping to remove Burmese pythons from the wild in record numbers.
When Florida announced that it intended to release predators into the wild, the world laughed. It sounded dangerous, even careless. But the discussion was motivated by a desperate scientific investigation. The fading Everglades had no choice but to do this. What followed will test what we thought was true about the natural equilibrium. Before ridiculing Florida's gaming excessively, maybe we should ask what kind of circumstances forced someone to make such a dramatic choice. What was happening that no one seemed to notice? Let's start at the beginning, the silent end of the world long before this chaos began. The Florida Everglades looked like something from a nature documentary. The endless green sawgrass stretched into the distance, broken only by the glint of shallow water. Here, raccoons ran through the wetlands, birds flew overhead, and bobcats prowled the edges of the woods. Life flowed harmoniously, with each organism contributing to a system estimated to be worth $31.5 billion a year. It was one of the few places on Earth where wild still meant wild because nobody believed that homeostasis could be broken so softly, instead of starting with a big boom. This story starts with a storm. In 1992, Hurricane Andrew tore through southern Florida, demolishing homes and causing damage to a reptile breeding facility near Miami. When the winds died, a few exotic snakes had entered the wetlands. Stressed-out pet owners thought they were releasing their cute Burmese pythons into the wild during this time. No one thought about it for years.
What I think everybody wants to see is get these Burmese pythons out of the Florida Everglades.
There were some seemingly harmless snakes, but they weren't. The first sight turned into something darker. Over time, the population increased quickly. What started out as the release of a few pets turned into a clandestine invasion. Now, experts estimate that between 100,000 and 300,000 pythons slither through South Florida's wetlands. Over the course of the mating season, each female can deposit close to 100 eggs. Once they are hidden in the forest, they multiply faster than anyone could track or capture them. And the wildlife-rich paradise known as the Everglades is starting to settle down. Devastating figures also started to shift. Bobcat, opossum, and raccoon populations declined by 87.5%, 98.5%, and 93.9%, respectively. In many areas, deer sightings have dropped by over 90%, while marsh rabbits, which are often common, have virtually vanished. What they didn't eat was moved by the pythons. The balance that held the Everglades together was eroding. What is the worst? Nobody noticed until it was nearly too late. At this point, we begin to question why these snakes were unbeatable. Because everything in Florida seemed to be tailored toward their success. The heat, humidity, and endless food supply created the perfect home. Because there were no natural predators to keep them in check, they thrived. Because of their concealment, they were essentially undetectable in the grass. For scientists, it was like fighting an invisible enemy. 10 additional snakes arrived for each one that was eliminated. The invaders had found heaven and were consuming it. Moreover, these weren't your usual snakes. As apex predators, they could consume an entire deer. Some of them grew to be over 20 feet long and weighed over 200 pounds. Videos of pythons battling alligators started to surface, shocking the entire world. In the food chain, the python has taken the place of native predators as the dominating species. Because what had once symbolized Florida's wild beauty was now being used as a weapon. Nature was suffering terribly. However, the economic and ecological risks went far beyond wildlife. Millions of people rely on the Everglades' $31.5 billion ecosystem for tourism, fishing, and flood management. But pythons became a greater threat. Hunters and researchers have gathered over 23,000 snakes. Yet, that only makes up 1% of all snakes worldwide. While the others stay concealed, procreating, growing, and consuming in solitude. The marsh that once pulsed with life now vibrates with absence. Furthermore, while officials searched for solutions, nothing appeared to be working. Silence would quickly replace the laughter about Florida's crazy idea, to retaliate as the atmosphere crumbled from within. Even while everyone was mocking the plan, the real irony was that the end of the world had already arrived. It was neither loud nor flaming, but rather frightening, silent, and all too real. For a very long time, many believed that the Everglades could be reclaimed. What followed showed how misplaced that optimism was. Desperation and failure at first. Florida's response to the python invasion was reminiscent of an adventure film. Officials opened the gates to hunters, scientists, and anybody else brave enough to walk over miles of marsh in search of the crawling intruders. In 2013, the Florida Python Challenge was established as a 10-day tournament that sounded both audacious and desperate. With hooks, traps, and steely nerves, hundreds of people showed they're ready to do what decades of policy had failed to accomplish. By 2024, it had become an annual event. In just 1 year, 857 people traveled from all over the United States and even Canada to compete against the most famous Everglades residents. The capture of 195 Burmese pythons attracted widespread interest and admiration. The winner won a $10,000 grand prize and was hailed as a hero in the fight to save Florida's wild heart. For a moment, it appeared as if victory could at last be achieved. But the figures exposed a worse reality. A year later, the 2025 competition broke previous marks. The best hunter, Taylor Stanberry, caught almost 60 pythons, literally the most in the competition's history. A total of 294 snakes were removed by participants, which appeared to be a significant amount until you realized how small it was in relation to the estimated tens of thousands of snakes that are still slithering free. The Everglades were not healing. They were gasping. Furthermore, the population of pythons was expanding more quickly than anyone could monitor. To make up for the shortfall, the state employed specialists. The South Florida Water Management District hired 24 experienced hunters on an hourly basis to scout the wetlands throughout the year. These weren't weekend explorers. Rather, they were professional python chasers armed with all science had to offer. But the snakes always seemed to be one step ahead. As a result, Florida conducted a revolutionary experiment in high-tech warfare. Drones hovered over the wetlands, searching for movement. Dog teams were trained to detect reptile scent trails. Wildlife biologists even fitted GPS collars to raccoons and possums to monitor potential predatory areas. And engineers developed robotic rabbits that released heat and sent 2 full pythons into striking. One of the most daring initiatives was to use scout snakes with tiny radio transmitters to direct researchers to hidden breeding females. Humans were interested in winning this ecological chess game, but the more the snakes battled, the faster they seemed to spread. Since 2017, contractors have removed around 23,000 pythons from the wild. It appears remarkable, until you learn that experts estimate that to be less than 1% of the population. Large-scale eradication attempts rarely produced results. Every time a hunter killed one, many others hatched elsewhere. It was like trying to empty the ocean with a bucket. The frustration was hard to hide. After years of labor, billions of dollars in financing, and countless experiments, it became clear that the pythons were not going anywhere. The best anyone could do was slow them down. Scientists began publicly admitting what many had long feared, that total eradication is not possible. These predators had claimed the Everglades as their own, and no one had figured out how to take them back. With every unsuccessful attempt, the feeling of helplessness grew. Hunters went farther into the marshes, drones soared higher, and technology developed, yet snakes adapted faster. As they slithered north into new habitats, they disregarded boundaries imposed by humans. Every solution seemed to reach a dead end. Florida reached a breaking point because of this growing sense of loss. What could stop them if manpower, money, and technology couldn't? Somewhere amid that frustration, a mad idea began to take shape, and scientists were faced with an impossible problem. How can you fight an enemy that you are unable to observe, capture, or kill fast enough? Pythons perverted present what if. Rather than the pythons slithering across Florida's wetlands, something much smaller was hiding beneath them. You see, deep within the Everglades, the invaders brought with them an invisible parasite that is currently altering the state's ecological narrative. The snake lungworm is called Raeliatella orientalis. Furthermore, despite the fact that pythons are frequently the center of attention, this parasite is quietly producing a whole new kind of chaos. It all started with a hitchhiker who went undiscovered, alongside Burmese pythons. The lungworm was initially brought to Florida's wild habitat from Asia. After the snakes settled down, the parasite seemed to have been waiting for the appropriate moment to infiltrate the local food chain. Python droppings carried the worm's eggs into the marsh, which were subsequently eaten by cockroaches, which were then eaten by frogs and lizards. Then, as they followed those smaller prey, the local snakes unknowingly devoured the main menace. Inside the snake's body, the larvae began their journey. They tunneled into the stomach, where they grew and were fed, before entering the lungs. Many native snakes, especially the smaller ones, are severely affected by this virus. The worms, which consume blood and tissue, progressively suffocate the animal from the inside out. Some snakes just starve to death because they are unable to hunt, have trouble breathing, and have less energy. Researchers have found snakes with pneumonia, open lung lesions, and, in some cases, dozens of worms scuttling out of their mouths. You never forget it once you've seen it. Scientists were shocked to learn how far the lungworm had gone. According to some reports, the parasite is presently found in dozens of counties, some of which are as far north as Jacksonville and even the Panhandle. It has already affected 18 native snake species in Florida. Despite the fact that the pythons started this, the lungworm is no longer waiting for them. The fact that it is maneuvering through Florida's native snakes on its own is frightening. When local snakes die, the balance is disrupted. The lack of food for tiny predators and the growth of rodents upend entire ecosystems. These snakes serve as predators, prey, and pest controllers in addition to being supporting characters. Scientists worry that the lungworm would still exist even if all pythons were eliminated tomorrow. It exists, is alive, and is expanding within the very species created to preserve the equilibrium of Florida's wild.
Florida is deploying robotic rabbits to help capture invasive Burmese pythons in the Everglades.
But this story has one odd twist. The Florida cottonmouth, a native pit viper, seems to be impervious to the parasite's attack. No one knows for sure why. Is it inherited? Nutrition? A natural immunity evolved throughout time. Whatever the reason, is that it's one of the few positive secrets in an otherwise depressing picture. What began as a battle with giant snakes has developed into something far more complex. At the moment, the hidden invader is spreading more widely than the predator who introduced it. There is no cure, no treatment, and no clear way to stop it. Every sick snake releases more parasites into the wild, and every snake death weakens the ecology. In Florida, the battle against pythons was already challenging. Right now, it is up against an opponent that is too little to notice, and that won't go away. The state thought it had a predator issue. Instead, it might be seeing the slow rise of an entirely new pandemic. As the crisis worsened, the ideas grew increasingly illogical. Moreover, one plan in particular went beyond what was reasonable. The laughable plan when the news initially came out. It sounded like something from a late-night comedy sketch. Florida officials announced they were bringing hundreds of native non-venomous eastern indigo snakes back into the wild to address the state's invasive python problem. The headline alone started a domino effect. Jokes, memes, and disbelief overtook social media in a matter of hours.
This is the 9th year state agencies have released eastern indigo snakes back into the wild in the Florida Panhandle.
Florida's battle was never limited to the parasite, the python, or the chaos that lurked. Beneath the marsh, it was a fight against both time and the delusion that nature could ever be fully subjugated by humans. What started out as a snake invasion turned into a mirror that reflected everything brittle about our world, including how decades of harmony can be destroyed by a tiny imbalance. It was believed that the Everglades would exist forever, a living, breathing ecosystem impervious to human error. However, nature did not retaliate with fury or fire when the storms, snakes and parasites took hold. It's just ... altered, silently, forever. The fact that the end of the world doesn't include explosions or headlines is arguably the most horrifying reality of all. While the rest of us scroll, chuckle, and go on, it arrives silently beneath the sea. Releasing predators to combat other predators was a desperate attempt in Florida. But it wasn't insane. Whispered into a disappearing wilderness. It was a last prayer, a reminder that the echo doesn't end at the swamp. When the wild starts to disintegrate, we are all affected by it. Because Florida was never the only state affected by the Everglades. They served as a warning from EARTHA, prophecy of survival, stillness, and scales.